The clicking started before we saw anything, and when we finally saw it on the second ridge above the Harmon fire, it was running on 4 limbs with its back bent the wrong direction entirely. I am writing this letter to you, Samuel, because your father has now been in the ground 4 months, and whatever oath of silence he kept is buried with him, and because you asked me last Easter in a tone that told me you had already begun to suspect the shape of the answer. You are 26 years old. You have your father's habit of pressing a subject until it gives way, and you have my stubbornness in equal measure, and so I think you will not stop asking until someone tells you the truth of the 1851 crossing. I am that someone. I am 61 years old, and I have been carrying this account the way a woman carries a stone in her shoe on a very long walk, aware of it with every step, telling herself she will sit down and remove it when the path gets easier, and discovering that the path never does. So here is the truth of it, to the best of my recollection and to the full weight of my conscience. And when you have read it, I want you to burn it, and I want you to understand why I say the outrider's name nowhere in these pages, and I want you to honor that. I will say one thing about his name before I close this letter, and I will say it only once, and it is this: I knew it. Your father knew it. Every adult member of the Aldrin Company knew it. We chose not to write it, not in the party record, not in the certificate of employment your father signed at Fort Hall, not in any letter I have composed in the 30 years since, and I am not starting now. He told us, on the 3rd day after the scaffold, that naming him in connection with what happened could invite the thing's attention back to the name, the way a scent invites a hound. I do not know if I believe that. I do not know what I believe about most of what I witnessed, but I know that we owe him every courtesy we have left to give, and that courtesy is the smallest of the debts we carry. Your father, Samuel, was 34 years old in the autumn of 1851, and he was wagon captain of what we called the Aldrin Company, which was not a formal company at all, but 14 families who had organized themselves in Westport in the spring, under your grandfather Aldrin's original guidance. And then your grandfather had taken a fever outside of Independence, and your father had assumed the captaincy because he was the most competent man remaining, and because nobody else wanted the responsibility badly enough to take it from him. He was a good captain. I want you to know that before you read anything else I have written here. He was a good captain under conditions that would have broken a lesser man entirely, and when he failed in the way that careful, conscientious men sometimes fail, which is by calculating the odds and making the choice that protected the most people and sacrificed the one. I was 29 that autumn. We had our 2 older girls with us, and I was carrying you, though I did not know it yet. The party numbered 53 souls in 14 wagons, with 3 spare oxen and 1 mule that belonged to the Claflin family, and that none of us liked much, including the Claflins. We had lost 2 men to the Sweetwater Passage and 1 child to fever in the weeks before, and we were tired in the bone-deep way that settles into a traveler after months of trail and does not lift again until they have slept 4 consecutive nights under a solid roof. The high desert south of the Snake River Plain does not offer a solid roof. What it offers is sage and alkali flat and ridge country that goes on and on under a sky so large and empty that a person can feel very small in it even before they understand that something in it has noticed them. We hired the outrider at Fort Hall in the 2nd week of September. He came recommended by the post factor, a man named Greer who dealt in skins and provisions, and who had been operating out of the fort for 11 years, and who was not given to foolishness. Greer told your father that the outrider knew the stretch of trail south of the Snake better than any man available for hire at the post, that he had guided 3 parties through in the past 2 years without significant loss, and that he was Diné by birth, but had spent considerable time in that territory for reasons Greer did not go into, and that your father did not press him on. He was perhaps 40 years old. He was lean in the way of a man accustomed to long distances, and he moved quietly, and he did not speak much. But when he spoke, he was precise, and your father valued precision in a man above almost anything else. On the first day out from Fort Hall, the outrider rode at the head of the column without conversation and mapped the day's route without ceremony, and brought us to water exactly when he had said he would, and your father came to dinner satisfied and told me that we had hired well. On the second day, the same. On the evening of the second day, we camped in a shallow draw between two low ridges, the sage thick on the slopes and the air tasting of dust and dry grass, and something else underneath it that I could not identify at the time, and that I now think of simply as the smell of that particular stretch of high desert, which has no equivalent that I have found in Oregon or anywhere else I have been. It was a thin smell, cold and slightly sweet, like something had been burned a long time ago, and the memory of the burning was still present in the ground. I am telling this in the order it happened, Samuel, because I want you to understand how it built, how each piece came before the next, how at no point did any of us look up and recognize the shape of what we were moving through until we were already deep in it. That is the nature of it, I think. You walk into it one ordinary step at a time. The sound was the first thing. I want to be clear that it preceded everything else by 2 full nights, because I know your father's account of events, the account he gave the party afterward, placed the sound later, and I believe he did that without intending to deceive, because men under stress remember events in the order that makes narrative sense, rather than the order they actually occurred. But I am a precise woman, Samuel, and I kept a diary, and my diary is open on this table as I write, and the diary says the sound began on the second night out from Fort Hall, which was the night before we reached the burial scaffold. I had heard the girls to sleep, and I was sitting outside the wagon on the step, with the diary in my lap, and a small candle in a tin box, and the camp was mostly quiet, the fires low, the night watch passing in his slow circuit. It was coming on 10 o'clock by my reckoning. The sky was enormous, and very clear and cold, the way a high desert sky gets cold in September when the sun is down, the stars crowding together so thickly that the darkness between them seems like the exception. I heard it from the tree line to the north. I should explain the tree line. There was no proper forest there, not the way we had come to think of forest in the eastern country, but the low ridge above us carried a scatter of juniper and stunted pine, and in the dark that line of trees showed as a ragged black edge against the stars, and the sound came from somewhere inside that edge. It was a dry sound, a clicking, not continuous, not a rattle, not an animal call I recognized, but a sequence of sharp, dry clicks with a rhythm to them, and the rhythm was what made the hair lift on my arms, because it was too regular to be accidental. Click, pause, click, click, pause, click, and then silence for a count of 5 or 6, and then the sequence again. It reminded me of nothing so much as someone cracking their knuckles in a pattern, deliberately, one joint at a time, working through the fingers in order. And it was very clear, not muffled by distance, not echoey. It was the sound of something that was where the sound was, not a sound that had traveled to reach me. I sat very still. The night watch, whose name was Birch, passed between my position and the ridge, and I saw him pause for a moment, his silhouette stopping, his head turning toward the tree line. Then he continued his circuit. I noted this in the diary. I said, Birch heard it too. The sound went on for perhaps 20 minutes and then stopped entirely, and after another half hour I went inside and lay down beside your father and did not sleep well. I did not mention it to him in the morning. I will confess that, and not try to justify it. I was not certain what I had heard. I did not want to present your father with something he would have to act on when I had so little to offer him beyond a sense of unease. I told myself it was an animal. I told myself the desert had animals I did not know. I put it in the diary, and I left it there, and we broke camp and moved on. That was the third day. I will come back to the scaffold in a moment, but I want you to know first that the clicking and the scaffold were connected from the beginning, that the sequence of events your father believed, that the scaffold came first and the trouble followed it, was not the accurate sequence, and that I think the thing had been watching us for at least a day before anyone in the party gave it a reason to approach. I do not know what that means. I have wondered about it for 30 years. I have never come to a conclusion that satisfies me. The burial scaffold was north of the trail by perhaps a quarter mile, up a short rise covered in dry grass and flat stone. It was not on the trail. You had to leave the trail to reach it. I do not know why any member of the party left the trail at that point. The trail was well marked, and the day was not particularly difficult, and there was no reason to go north into the scrub country. The young man's name was Clafford. He was 19 years old, traveling with his uncle's family, and he was the kind of young man who could not pass an interesting-looking thing at a distance without going to investigate it. He saw the scaffold from the trail, he said afterward, and thought it might be a deer cache, some kind of storage structure, and he rode out to look. He was gone perhaps 40 minutes and returned without comment, and we camped that evening on a flat alkali pan some miles beyond. I did not know about the scaffold until the following morning. I did not know about what Clafford had taken until the morning after that. What I knew the following morning, the fourth morning out from Fort Hall, was the yoke. Our lead ox team was a pair of red-brown animals, named by the Colton family who owned them, Drum and Bell. Reliable animals, well-behaved. I had walked beside them for much of the crossing and was familiar with their yokes and their rigging. When I went forward in the morning to check the teams, which was a habit of mine while your father spoke to the outrider about the day's route, I saw something on Drum's yoke that had not been there the night before. It was a strip of tanned hide, perhaps 4 inches wide and 18 inches long, and it was stitched along both edges with what I took at first glance to be dark thread. I reached out to touch it, and when I looked more closely at what I had assumed was thread, I stopped moving entirely. It was hair, human hair, fine, dark, stitched in tight and regular stitches through the holes punched in the hide with something sharp. There were markings on the flesh side of the hide, worked into it with something pointed, symbols of a kind I did not recognize and cannot describe accurately, except to say that they were not decorative. They had the quality of purposeful marks rather than ornamental ones. I did not touch it. I called for your father, and he came, and then he called for the outrider. The outrider came forward and saw it from 8 feet away and stopped walking. I want you to understand that this man had not shown particular alarm at anything in the 4 days we had traveled with him. He was not a demonstrative person. When he stopped walking at 8 feet, your father and I both understood that something was wrong before a word was spoken. He said, quietly and without dramatics, "Do not touch that." He studied it for a long moment without moving closer. Then he looked at your father and asked him directly, had anyone in the party been away from the column the previous day? Had anyone gone north of the trail? Your father called for a general accounting, and after some time Clafford came forward and admitted the scout and the scaffold, and the outrider listened without changing his expression. Then he asked what Clafford had taken. Clafford denied it for several minutes. Then, under pressure from his uncle, he produced a small carved figure from his coat pocket, bone or pale wood, perhaps 4 inches long, the shape of an animal I could not identify with certainty, worn smooth with age. The outrider looked at it and then looked away immediately, deliberately. He said, "He took that from the interior of the scaffold." Clafford said he had only moved it a little, that it had been lying loose on the platform, that he hadn't thought anything of it. The outrider was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to your father and spoke at some length in a careful, measured voice, and what he said is what I recorded as best I could that evening in my diary, and I will reproduce it here as faithfully as I can. He told your father that the territory we were crossing had a custodian. That was the word he used, and that the custodian was old, older than any living community in that country, and that it operated under a set of terms that were known to certain people, and that those people had maintained the crossing arrangement for generations. The terms were simple. You passed through, you took nothing, you disturbed nothing, you moved as guests, and you left as guests. The scaffold, and what was on it, were under the custodian's protection specifically, not merely incidentally. The strip of hide on the yoke was not a warning in the way we might think of a warning. It was an accounting. It was the equivalent of a bill presented for goods already taken. Your father asked what happened if the bill was not paid. The outrider said the custodian would collect a substitute. Your father asked what that meant. The outrider said the object had to be returned, not buried, not left at the trailside, not thrown into the scrub, returned to the exact scaffold, placed back in the exact position from which it had been taken, before the following dawn. It had to be carried by a single person, alone, without a light source of any kind, and without turning back once the walk began. And the strip of hide had to be left on the yoke, not handled, not moved, exactly as it was. Your father took this in with the careful attention he gave to supply calculations and route conditions, and then he said, reasonably, that he understood the importance of respecting the dead, and that Clafford would face consequences for his behavior, and that they would leave the fetish at the next prominent landmark they passed, and that surely that was adequate. The outrider said it was not. Your father said he was not sending any member of his party a quarter-mile into dark scrub country, alone and without a lantern. The outrider said then the custodian would take what it was owed. Your father said he had 53 people under his care, and he would not risk any of them on the basis of a story about a territorial spirit. The outrider looked at your father for a moment, and then said, "You heard it last night. So did your wife." Your father turned to me. I told him about the clicking. I told him about the tree line. Your father was quiet for a longer time after that. Then he called a meeting of the family heads. I have attended many disagreements in my life. I have sat through arguments about roots and resources and religious practice and the distribution of blame after misfortune. I have never attended a meeting in my life that had the particular quality of that one. Sitting on the alkali flat with the sun still early and the wagons in their overnight ring, and 53 people within earshot, arguing in low, taut voices about whether to send a man alone into the dark scrubland for the appeasement of something that none of them had yet seen. The Harmon family, all 3 brothers and their wives, voted for return. Send Clafford himself, they said. He took it. He carries it back. The Kells family agreed. The Prentice family agreed. 3 families out of 14, and of the 3 Clafford's uncle's family was one of them, which was notable because they were putting their own blood at the head of the line. The other families were not unanimous in opposition, but they were opposed in sufficient numbers that your father, counting heads the way a careful man counts provisions, concluded that the majority would not sanction it. 4 families were flatly against sending anyone into the dark for any reason. 3 families said they were willing to wait and try returning in daylight, which the outrider told them was not the arrangement. 2 families said nothing, and your father counted silence as abstention. The meeting ended without resolution, and your father told the outrider they would speak more that evening, and the outrider nodded once and said, "Then I will tell you what I saw last night." And your father said, "When I say this evening, I mean this evening." And the outrider said nothing further. We moved that day. I think moving was your father's way of holding the shape of normalcy over the situation, keeping the routine of the trail as a frame around what was happening, as if motion itself were a form of management. We made perhaps 11 miles on a good track, and the day was clear, and the wind was mild, and there was no clicking and no sign of anything unusual. And by midday, I could feel the relief moving through the column, like a small warm current, people straightening their backs, the younger children beginning to make noise again, in the ways children do when the adults around them have relaxed. I did not relax. I had my diary, and I had the outrider's face from the morning, and I had the strip of stitched hide still on Drum's yoke, which nobody would go near, and I kept my watch that afternoon as we traveled, and I looked at the ridgelines. I saw it at approximately 4 in the afternoon, in the high light of a clear autumn day, and I want to be slow and careful in this part of the account because I have told it imprecisely in my own mind many times, filling gaps with what I expected to see rather than what I actually saw, and I owe you the accurate version. The ridge to our north was perhaps 300 yards from the trail, low and rocky with the same scatter of juniper along the crown. The thing was on the ridge. It was moving along the ridge line at a pace roughly equivalent to our own, neither gaining nor falling behind. It was pale, not white, but the color of dry grass or old bone, and it was moving on 4 limbs, but it was not moving the way a quadruped moves. There is a regularity to the gait of an animal on 4 legs, a symmetry and a rhythm that comes from the design of the thing. This had no such symmetry. Its movements were sequential rather than symmetrical. It placed one limb, then the next, in an order that suggested considered action rather than natural gait. And the angle of its joints was not the angle of any animal I know. The knees or elbows or whatever served those functions bent outward in a way that made the walking look effortful and deliberate and wrong. I could not see its face at that distance. I could see that its head was carried low and that it was oriented toward the column. I could see that it was large. Not impossibly large, not the size of a house, but large in the way of a creature that is larger than it should be for a thing moving upright when it chose to, and I had the strong and unshakable impression, though I cannot explain the basis for it, that it was choosing not to move upright, that the 4-limbed gait was a choice, not a necessity. I watched it for perhaps 3 minutes before I called quietly to the outrider, who was riding to my left. He looked at the ridge. He looked for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "It has been there since noon." I asked him why he had not told anyone. He said, "Because at noon it was not looking at you." He told me then, riding beside the wagon in a voice low enough that only I could hear it, that the thing had been parallel to the column all day, that it had made no approach, that this was consistent with what he understood of its behavior when an account was open and unpaid. It was not hunting, it was attending. He used that word, attending. It moved where they moved, and waited where they waited, and it would continue to attend until the account was satisfied, or until dusk passed into true dark, at which point, he said, its behavior would change in a way he did not describe in detail. I asked him to be specific. He said that at dark it would stop attending and start collecting. I asked who it would collect. He said the object had been taken by one person, but the account was held against the party as a whole, and that its selection method was not one he had observed firsthand, but that the tradition was clear on the point that it did not take only the responsible party. It took what was nearest when the time came. We were moving. Our children were in the wagon behind me. I sat with that information for the remainder of the afternoon. Your father called the second meeting at 5 o'clock, with the sun still an hour from the ridge. I had spoken to him privately before it, told him what I had seen and what the outrider had said, and I had spoken to him with considerably less restraint than I had employed in the morning meeting, and your father, who was a man who could be moved by precise information, even when it ran against his inclinations, came to the meeting visibly altered. He was still your father, still the captain of the column, still thinking in terms of his responsibility to 53 people. But he had seen the thing on the ridge by then himself, and I could see in the set of his jaw that it had affected him. The Harmon brothers had seen it too. Several of the night watch had seen it and told others, and the mood of the company had changed significantly in the hours between meetings. Your father put it plainly. The outrider believed the account required satisfaction before nightfall. That satisfaction required a single person to carry the object back to the scaffold alone and in the dark, and that the alternative was to trust that their progress had already put sufficient distance between themselves and the territory to invalidate the arrangement, which the outrider had told him flatly was not how the arrangement worked. He laid it out like a logistics problem. He was very good at that. The Harmon brothers renewed their argument for sending Clafford. Clafford's uncle objected on the grounds of his nephew's age. Someone, I believe it was one of the Kells men, said that they were a Christian company and that they were not going to conduct ritual appeasement of a pagan spirit and that God's protection was sufficient, and there was a murmur of agreement from some portion of the group that your father did not attempt to suppress because he knew better than to suppress it and because it bought him a moment's pause to think. The outrider sat through this without speaking. When the murmur had run its course, he looked at your father and said that he was not asking anyone to believe in the thing. Belief was irrelevant. He had seen it on the ridge. Everyone who had looked north had seen it on the ridge. The question of what they believed about its nature was separate from the question of what it would do at dark. Someone asked what the outrider thought it was. He paused before answering, and this pause had a different quality from his normal pauses, which were simply the pauses of a man who thought before he spoke. This was a pause that had weight and care inside it, as if the answer carried a cost. Then he said only that it was very old, and that it lived in the terms of an arrangement, and that the arrangement was being broken. Your father asked, for the second time, whether the outrider himself would go. And the outrider, for the second time, said he would go if it came to it. Your father said it was not going to come to it, because he was not going to send a hired man into the dark with the consequences from another man's theft on his shoulders. He said he would go himself. I will tell you honestly, Samuel, that when your father said this, I believed him entirely, and I was afraid in a different way than I had been afraid all day, a sharper and more focused kind of fear, because the outrider had not offered himself casually, and your father was not the person the outrider had in mind when he had made the offer. There was a specific shape to what the outrider had described that did not fit your father, and I did not know the full dimension of that shape then, but I felt its outline. The outrider said, quietly and without any visible emotion, that the arrangement he was describing was not one your father could satisfy. It was not a question of courage or of willingness. The object needed to be carried by someone who understood what they were carrying and what they were placing it back into, and that understanding was not transferable by good intentions. Your father asked him to explain that. The outrider said there were terms to the return, not only the physical conditions of the return, no light, no turning back, but terms of conduct that the carrier had to understand and honor, and that he was not going to explain those terms to the group, because half of them would use the explanation as material for more argument, and the light was going. He was right that the light was going. The sun was touching the western ridge. I watched the shadow line begin to move east across the alkali flat. Your father said, "Then explain them to me. I will carry the object." The outrider looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something move across his face that I have never been able to name precisely. It was not pity, and it was not contempt, and it was not sorrow, but it contained something of all three. He said, "You will not, Captain, because if you walk into the dark carrying that object and you cannot complete the terms, no one in this company will reach Oregon." The shadow line crossed the camp. The sun was below the ridge. And then the clicking started. It came from the north, from somewhere in the juniper line on the ridge above us, and it was louder than the night before, noticeably louder, and it had a different rhythm. The previous night's clicking had been measured and distant, almost patient, that slow sequence of knuckle crack sounds, spaced evenly apart. This was faster, and the spacing was irregular, and there was a quality to the irregularity that felt purposeful, as if it were a different kind of statement from the one the night before had been. The camp went very quiet. Children who had been making noise stopped without being told. The oxen shifted. Drum and bell moved against each other with a slow, distressed pressing motion, and the strip of stitched hide on the yoke swung gently. The outrider stood up from where he had been crouching beside the fire ring, and he was very calm, and he looked at your father, and your father looked at the direction of the clicking, and then your father looked at the outrider, and the outrider said, quietly and very clearly, "I will go." Your father said, "I can't allow it." The outrider said, "You cannot stop it." And your father, who was the most capable man I have known in my life, who had brought 14 families 2,000 miles through country that killed people routinely, and had lost only 3 along the way through no failure of his own management. Your father stood in the fading light, with the clicking growing faster in the juniper above us, and he said nothing. Because the outrider was right. Your father could not have completed the terms. None of us could have. None of us who did not already know what the outrider knew, who had not grown up in relation to that territory, and whatever laws governed the movements of the thing on the ridge. We were passing through. The outrider understood the ground. There is a difference between those two conditions that no amount of good intention can bridge, and your father knew it, and the silence was your father knowing it. The fetish was brought forward. Clafford was not asked to bring it himself. He handed it to his uncle, and his uncle brought it to the meeting fire and set it on the ground, and the outrider did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it. He studied it for a moment, with an expression I cannot describe, except to say that he was thinking about more than one thing at once. Then he crouched, and he picked it up with both hands, and he wrapped it in a piece of cloth he had taken from his jacket pocket, and he put it inside the jacket, against his chest. Your father asked him what he needed. The outrider said he needed no one to follow him, no one to call his name, no one to put a lantern in the window of the wagon nearest the north side. He said he would be back before dawn, or he would not be back, and that either way the party should move at first light and not look back. Your father tried once more to object, to say they would wait for him, to say they would hold the crossing for 2 days if necessary. The outrider put his hand briefly on your father's shoulder. It was not a gesture I had seen him make before, and it was not a long gesture, and then it was over. He said, "Move at first light." I am writing this very slowly now, because I am at the part that I have turned away from for 30 years, and I am not going to turn away from it any longer. The outrider walked north out of the camp, at what I estimated was a quarter hour past full dark. The clicking on the ridge had stopped approximately 10 minutes before this. That cessation was perhaps more frightening than the clicking had been, because it meant the thing was no longer where it had been, and we did not know where it was. I stationed myself at the north side of the wagon ring, at the gap between the last 2 wagons, and I watched him go. He walked without hesitation and without looking back, and he crossed the alkali flat with his stride steady, and then the darkness absorbed him completely, not gradually, but with a suddenness that felt deliberate, as if the dark had simply closed around him the way water closes around a stone. I stood at that gap for a long time. Your father came and stood beside me. Neither of us spoke. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard the clicking again, but it was not from the ridge. It was from somewhere in the middle distance, somewhere in the flat scrubland between the camp and the ridge, and it was very brief, no more than 4 or 5 seconds of the rapid sequence, and then it stopped. And then, a moment later, from a direction that I cannot confidently place even now, somewhere south and east of where the brief sequence had come from, I heard something that was not clicking. It was a low sound, a carrying sound, not a shout, not a cry, but something with the quality of a human voice, doing something I am not able to name precisely. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then there was nothing. The night was completely silent for the remainder of it. Your father went among the wagons after midnight to check the watch and to settle 2 or 3 of the children who had been disturbed, and when he came back to me, he stood for a while in silence, and then he said, "We will hold until dawn." And I said, "He said first light," and your father said, "Yes," and said nothing else. We held until dawn. There was no sign of movement in the scrubland. There was no further clicking. The strip of hide was still on Drum's yoke. At first light your father called the watch to their positions and the drivers to their teams, and he came to me and took my hand and held it briefly, which he rarely did in company, and then he went to the head of the column, and we moved out. I looked north for the first quarter mile, until the trail turned, and the alkali flat fell behind us, and I saw nothing. No figure on the ridge, no movement in the scrub, nothing. We made Oregon. You were born the following March in the Willamette Valley, and you were healthy, and your father was proud of you in the way that quiet men are proud, thoroughly and without display. But I want to tell you what happened at the Dry Creek crossing, which was the last incident of the trail I have not yet accounted for. We had been moving for 4 days after the camp, moving well, the weather holding and the trail clear, and the atmosphere among the company had shifted into something that I can only describe as a collective agreement not to speak of what had happened. No one raised it at the evening fires. Claffett's uncle spoke to his nephew privately at some point, and I do not know what was said, but the young man rode with his head down for the remainder of the crossing and did not explore again. Your father spoke to the party on the second evening and told them that the outrider had been retained through Fort Hall only, and that his engagement had concluded, and that they were adequately guided from this point forward, and this was accepted without comment. The strip of stitched hide was still on Drum's yoke. On the 4th morning, your father and 2 of the Harmon brothers held a discussion about the hide strip that I was not party to but whose conclusion I observed. Your father came to me and asked if I thought it should be removed. He was asking me, I understood, not because I had particular expertise, but because I had been the most attentive witness and he respected my observation, and because he trusted my instinct. I told him I would not touch it. I told him I did not know what the outrider would have done with it if he had come back, whether he would have removed it or left it or handled it in some specific way, and that in the absence of that knowledge, I did not think any of us should make a decision about it. Your father nodded slowly and then said, "We might reach Oregon with it still there." I said, "Then we reach Oregon with it still there." And we did. The oxen crossed the valley in October, and we settled our claim, and Drum and Bell were sold in the spring to a farm operation outside of Salem, yoke and all, and I do not know what became of the strip of stitched hide after that. I have sometimes wondered if whoever bought those animals noticed it. I have sometimes wondered what they made of it. I have mostly tried not to think about it. Now I have told you the material events of the 1851 crossing, Samuel, and I owe you the thing I have not yet told you, which is what happened at the Dry Creek crossing between the 1st and 2nd days of travel after the camp. It was on the afternoon of the 1st day out. We had come down off a stretch of ridge country into a dry creek bed, not much of a crossing, maybe 20 feet across, and the sand dry and cracked, with a thin line of moisture down the center, the kind of crossing you barely remember on a long trail because it asks nothing of you. The column came down into it and crossed without difficulty, family by family, the wagons dragging through the sand and up the far bank with the usual effort, and I was watching from the far bank as the last wagons came through. He was standing at the near bank. I want to be accurate. He was standing at the edge where the scrub grass met the creek sand on the near side, and he was standing still, which is what made me see him, the stillness against the movement of the wagons passing. He was dressed as I had always seen him dressed, nothing remarkable in his appearance. He had something held against his chest, both hands closed over it, the way a person holds something small they are taking care of. He watched the last wagon cross. He did not wave, and he did not call out. He simply stood and watched until the wagon was up the bank and the column had moved on, and then he was gone. I do not mean he walked away, or that he disappeared in any unusual fashion. I mean I looked back from the trail 50 yards on, and he was not there. I told no one. I have not told anyone in 30 years, not because I was afraid of being disbelieved, but because telling it would have required naming him, and I promised myself then that I would not name him in connection with what happened, and I have kept that promise, and I am keeping it still. He had the fetish in his hands. I am certain of that. I do not know what it meant that he had it, whether the return had been completed and he was carrying it back to us for some reason, or whether the terms had changed, or whether what I saw at the crossing was something other than what it appeared to be. I have not been able to resolve this. I do not expect to resolve it before I die. What I know is what his absence in the camp cost, and what I know is that the cost was ours by right, because we were the ones who took the thing from the scaffold, and we were the ones who could not complete the return ourselves. And we were the ones who let a man walk into the dark on our behalf, without the language to insist that he not. Now I must come to the instruction I mentioned at the beginning of this letter. The outrider's name must not appear in writing. This is the instruction. You may think I am being superstitious, and you may be right. And I have thought many times over the years that my insistence on this has more to do with my own guilt than with any real protection it affords him or any practical effect it has on anything in the living world. But it costs you nothing to honor it, and it would cost me considerably to abandon it, and I am asking you to honor it. I knew his name. I knew it clearly, and I used it when I spoke to him directly as any one person speaks to another, and I will take it to my grave. And this is not sentiment, Samuel. This is the only thing left I can do for a man who walked north into a dark scrubland, so that your father's 53 people could reach Oregon intact. And so that you could be born in the Willamette Valley in March of 1852 and grow up to be the man you are, and so that your sisters could grow up healthy and whole, and so that your father, God rest him, could spend 30 years farming the valley and loving his family and holding his silence about the price of it. Do not look for the scaffold. Do not travel that stretch of the Snake River country looking for evidence of what I have described. I have seen what attends that territory, and I am telling you there is no knowledge to be gained from it that is worth the accounting. Your father's silence was not cowardice. I want you to know that above all other things I have written here. He was silent because the weight of what we owed was not something he could speak aloud without it breaking him, and he chose to carry it intact rather than lay it down in words and have it break in front of his children. I understand this choice. I have made a version of it myself for 30 years. But you asked, and you had the right to ask, and now you know. Burn this letter when you have read it twice. Read it twice so that you have it fully, and then burn it, and carry what you know in the place where your father carried his silence, privately and without display. Your father was a good man who made a bad calculation under impossible pressure, and the calculation cost one life that should not have been spent, and he knew it every day he lived, and I loved him every day he lived, and both of those things are true at once. The outrider's name dies with me. That is the last thing I have to give him. I love you, Samuel. Your mother, Margaret Aldrin, written at our home in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, the 14th of November, 1881. I will close with one thing more, and then I will seal this envelope. There are nights, even now, when the house is quiet, and the valley is dark, and the children have long since grown and gone, when I hear something in the timber behind the property. A dry sound, rhythmic and brief, close enough to carry through the bedroom window. It has come perhaps a dozen times in 30 years, and it is always the same. That sequence of sharp, dry clicks, measured, deliberate. And it always stops after a minute or two, and does not come again that night. I do not know what it means that I hear it here, so far from that alkali flat, so many years later. I do not know if it is what I think it is, or if it is a night bird, or a branch in the wind, and my own memory making it into something it is not. What I know is that when I hear it, I do not get up. I lie still, and I breathe, and I think of a man standing at the edge of a dry creek with something held carefully in his closed hands, watching us go, and I let it pass.